Welcome. Today we look back at one of the most defining events in human history, World War II. This was a conflict that reshaped nations, transformed societies, and changed the role of the United States in the world forever. What follows is not a story of heroes and villains alone, but a record of decisions, sacrifices, and consequences that continue to shape our present. This is the story of World War II. B-29 Superfortress, the aircraft, built to end a war. When the United States began designing the B-29 Superfortress, it was not simply building another bomber. It was attempting something unprecedented, an aircraft capable of carrying the war across an entire ocean, striking an enemy homeland from bases thousands of kilometers away, and returning safely. No bomber before it had combined such range, payload, altitude, and technological complexity. The B-29 was not an evolution. It was a leap. The origins of the B-29 lay in the harsh realities of the Pacific War. Japan's geography made conventional bombing extremely difficult. The Japanese home islands were far beyond the reach of existing bombers based in Allied-controlled territory. Aircraft that could strike Europe from England could not reach Tokyo from anywhere under Allied control in 1941. If the United States was to defeat Japan through air power, it needed a bomber unlike anything that existed. In 1939, even before the United States entered the war, the U.S. Army Air Corps issued a requirement for a super bomber. It had to fly farther, higher, and faster than any previous bomber. It had to carry a massive bomb load and defend itself without constant escort. Most importantly, it had to do this reliably over enormous distances. Boeing's proposal would become the B-29 Superfortress. From the beginning, the aircraft pushed the limits of engineering. The B-29 introduced pressurized crew compartments, allowing crews to operate at extreme altitudes without oxygen masks at all times. It featured remotely controlled gun turrets operated by analog computers, a revolutionary concept at the time. Its Wright R-3350 engines were powerful but complex, pushing performance to levels that strained available materials and manufacturing techniques. The aircraft was so advanced that development problems nearly derailed the program. Engine fires were common during early testing. Entire aircraft were lost in accidents. The cost of development was staggering, exceeding that of the Manhattan Project itself. Critics questioned whether the bomber would ever be reliable enough for combat. Yet the urgency of war meant the project could not be abandoned. Production began. Before the design was fully perfected, thousands of workers were trained to build an aircraft unlike any they had ever seen. New factories rose across the United States. Entire supply chains were created to support components that had never existed before. The B-29 was not just a plane, it was an industrial system. By the time the United States entered World War II, the B-29 was still unproven. But the strategic need was undeniable. Japan was beyond reach, and the Pacific War was grinding forward at enormous cost. American leaders believed that air power, if it could reach Japan directly, might shorten the war dramatically. Crews selected to fly the B-29 knew they were entering something new. Training was intense and dangerous. Pilots learned to manage engines that could overheat without warning. Engineers were trained to fight fires in flight. Navigators practiced long overwater routes where a single mistake could mean disappearance into the Pacific. The margin for error was small. The Superfortress was larger, more complex, and more demanding than any bomber before it. It required discipline, coordination, and constant vigilance. But it also promised something no other aircraft could deliver: the ability to strike the heart of Japan. When the B-29 finally entered combat, it would not merely participate in the Pacific War. It would redefine it. The aircraft had been built for one purpose: to end a war that seemed impossibly distant. And soon it would. First missions from China, extreme range, high cost, hard lessons. The first combat missions of the B-29 Superfortress revealed just how ambitious and dangerous the program truly was. In 1944, before Allied forces had secured bases closer to Japan, the only way to reach the Japanese home islands was from airfields in China. This plan, known as Operation Matterhorn, demanded an extraordinary logistical effort and placed immense strain on both aircraft and crews. The distances involved were unlike anything bomber forces had faced before. B-29s flying from bases in eastern China had to cross hundreds of kilometers of hostile territory and open ocean to reach targets in Japan. There were no alternate airfields, no emergency landing zones, and limited search and rescue capability. A single mechanical failure could mean the loss of aircraft and crew without a trace. Every mission was a calculated gamble. Logistics quickly became the greatest challenge. All fuel, bombs, spare parts, and supplies needed by the B-29s had to be flown into China over the Himalayas, a route known as the Hump. Transport aircraft carried fuel forward so that bombers could burn that same fuel on combat missions. The inefficiency was staggering. In some cases, it took multiple transport sorties to deliver enough fuel for a single B-29 bombing run. The cost in aircraft wear, accidents, and lives was high. Despite these obstacles, the first B-29 missions were launched in June 1944. The initial target was the Yawata Steel Works on the island of Kyushu. The mission demonstrated both the promise and the limitations of the Superfortress. The aircraft reached Japan and returned, proving that direct attacks on the home islands were possible. However, bombing accuracy was poor. High-altitude winds, later identified as the jet stream, disrupted bomb trajectories, scattering bombs far from intended targets. Crews struggled to compensate for conditions no one had previously encountered. Mechanical issues compounded the difficulty. The B-29's powerful engines, essential for long-range, high-altitude flight, were prone to overheating. Engine fires were a constant threat. Crews trained extensively to respond, often cutting fuel lines, feathering propellers, and manually extinguishing flames at altitude. Many aircraft were lost to engine failure without ever encountering enemy defenses. Japanese air defenses during this phase were limited but growing. Fighters attempted interceptions, and anti-aircraft fire became more accurate over time. Although losses to enemy action were initially modest, the cumulative toll of accidents, weather, and mechanical failure was severe. Crews often felt they were fighting the aircraft as much as the enemy. Morale reflected this tension. The B-29 was technologically advanced, but unforgiving. Crews knew they were pioneers, flying missions that pushed the limits of aviation. Successes were real, but incremental. Each mission produced lessons paid for in risk and loss. Commanders began to realize that while China-based operations proved the concept, they were not sustainable at the scale required to force Japan's surrender. Strategically, the limitations were clear. Bomb loads had to be reduced to extend range. Maintenance in forward bases was difficult. Weather forecasting was unreliable. Supply lines were fragile. The B-29 could reach Japan, but it could not yet do so efficiently or in overwhelming numbers. These early missions, however, were not failures. They provided critical data. crews learned how the aircraft behaved under combat conditions. Engineers gathered information on engine performance, fuel consumption, and structural stress. Bombardiers and navigators began adapting to high-altitude winds that would later reshape bombing tactics. Most importantly, American leadership drew a decisive conclusion. To use the B-29 effectively, they needed secure bases closer to Japan, reliable supply lines, and freedom from the crushing logistical burden of flying everything over mountains. The solution lay further west, across the Pacific. As the war advanced and Allied forces captured island chains, the Superfortress would finally be unleashed from bases designed for sustained, large-scale bombing. The lessons learned over China, earned at enormous cost, would shape the next phase of the B-29's war. And that next phase would bring the conflict directly to Japan's doorstep. The Mariana Islands, building the bases that brought Japan within reach. The limitations of the China-based B-29 campaign made one conclusion unavoidable. If the Superfortress was to achieve its purpose, it needed permanent, secure bases, closer to Japan. That opportunity emerged in the Central Pacific. The capture of the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, would become one of the most consequential strategic achievements of the entire war, not only for the United States, but for the future of air warfare itself. The Marianas were ideally positioned. From these islands, B-29s could reach the Japanese home islands with heavy bomb loads and still return safely. Unlike China, the islands could be supplied directly by sea, eliminating the crippling inefficiencies of airlifting fuel and bombs over mountains. However, securing them required some of the fiercest fighting of the Pacific War. The Battle of Saipan in June 1944 was the turning point. American Marines and Army units fought through well-prepared Japanese defenses in brutal conditions. Casualties were heavy on both sides. The battle also triggered political shock in Japan, leading to the resignation of Prime Minister Hideki Tojo. Saipan's fall placed Japan itself within bomber range for the first time, changing the strategic equation overnight. Tinian followed soon after. Though smaller than Saipan, it would become the most important B-29 base of the war. Engineers transformed the island with astonishing speed. Entire landscapes were flattened. Runways were built to unprecedented scale. Fuel storage, maintenance facilities, housing, hospitals, and command centers appeared almost overnight. At its peak, Tinian hosted thousands of B-29s and tens of thousands of personnel, making it the largest airbase in the world. Guam, retaken later in 1944, completed the triangle. Together, the Marianas formed an industrial and logistical platform unlike anything previously created for air warfare. Supplies flowed steadily by sea. Aircraft could be repaired properly. Crews could be rotated, trained, and supported without the constant crisis conditions that had plagued the China campaign. From the moment the first B-29s arrived, operations expanded rapidly. Unlike the long, marginal missions from China, Marianas-based sorties allowed for heavier bomb loads, more reliable navigation, and sustained pressure. The Superfortress was finally being used as it had been designed, not as an experimental weapon, but as a massed strategic force. Japanese defenses now faced a new reality. The distance from the Marianas to Japan was still long but manageable. Early warning time was limited. Fighter interceptions were difficult to coordinate. Anti-aircraft defenses existed, but they were not designed to handle continuous, large-scale raids at high altitude. The Japanese home islands, long shielded by distance, were now exposed. For B-29 crews, Conditions improved, but danger remained. Missions were still long, often lasting over 12 hours. Weather over the Pacific was unpredictable. Mechanical failure still meant ditching in open ocean. Japanese fighters and flak claimed aircraft and lives. Yet the scale of operations shifted morale. Crews were no longer isolated pioneers. They were part of an overwhelming force. The presence of the B-29s in the Marianas marked the beginning of a new phase of the Pacific War. The focus moved decisively to Japan itself. Industrial centers, transportation networks, and cities were now within reach. Strategic bombing would no longer be symbolic or limited. It would be systematic and relentless. The Marianas were more than captured islands. They were the foundation of a campaign that would bring unprecedented destruction and unprecedented decisions to the Japanese homeland. From these runways, the war would enter its final and most controversial phase. From thin air to firestorms, why high-altitude bombing failed and everything changed. When B-29 operations shifted to the Mariana Islands, American commanders expected the Superfortress to finally deliver decisive results through high-altitude precision bombing. The aircraft had been designed to fly above most defenses, drop bombs accurately, and return safely. On paper, the strategy was sound. In practice, it began to unravel almost immediately. The problem was the atmosphere itself. Over Japan, B-29 crews encountered something largely unknown to Allied planners. Extremely powerful high-altitude winds later identified as the jet stream. At bombing altitudes above 30,000 feet, winds could exceed 150 miles per hour. Bombs released under these conditions drifted wildly, sometimes landing miles from their targets. Even the most skilled bombardiers could not compensate consistently. Accuracy collapsed. Weather compounded the problem. Japan's climate produced frequent cloud cover that obscured targets. Industrial facilities were often hidden beneath layers of clouds and smoke. Radar bombing techniques existed, but they were still limited in precision. Missions frequently returned with little measurable damage, despite enormous effort, fuel consumption, and risk. Mechanical strain increased as well. Flying at maximum altitude placed heavy stress on engines already prone to overheating. Crews faced constant engine failures, fires, and forced aborts. Losses mounted not just from enemy action, but from accidents and mechanical breakdowns. The Superfortress could reach Japan, but it could not yet cripple it. By late 1944, American leadership faced a hard truth. The B-29 program was consuming massive resources without delivering proportional results. Time mattered. The war in the Pacific was grinding forward at tremendous cost in lives. Something had to change. That change came with a shift in leadership and doctrine. General Curtis LeMay took command of B-29 operations in the Marianas and made a radical decision. He abandoned the original concept of high-altitude precision bombing, at least temporarily, and ordered a shift to low-altitude nighttime bombing using incendiaries. It was a controversial move, flying lower exposed bombers to anti-aircraft fire. Night operations reduced navigation accuracy. Incendiary weapons raised moral and ethical concerns. Yet the logic was brutal and clear. Japanese cities were uniquely vulnerable. Much of urban Japan was built from wood and paper. Dense residential areas surrounded factories and workshops that were deeply integrated into civilian neighborhoods. Destroying industrial output meant destroying cities themselves. Incendiaries could do what high-explosive bombs could not. In March 1945, the new strategy was unleashed. On the night of March 9-10, More than 300 B-29s attacked Tokyo in Operation Meeting House. Flying at low altitude, they dropped thousands of tons of incendiary bombs. The result was a firestorm. Winds fed the flames, and entire districts were consumed. Tens of thousands of people were killed in a single night. Industrial output was devastated. The scale of destruction shocked even those who planned the mission. From a military perspective, the results were undeniable. Japanese production collapsed. Transportation networks were crippled. Morale was shattered. From a human perspective, the cost was horrifying. The line between civilian and military targets vanished entirely. For B-29 crews, the change in tactics altered everything. Flying lower reduced exposure to jet stream winds, but increased exposure to flak. Aircraft flew lighter, often stripped of defensive guns to increase bomb load and range. Crews faced new dangers, new stresses, and new psychological burdens. They could see fires burning beneath them, cities disappearing into smoke. Night firebombing became the dominant form of B-29 operations through the spring and summer of 1945. City after city was attacked. Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, and dozens of others burned. Japan's ability to continue the war eroded rapidly, yet surrender did not come. The shift from high-altitude precision to low-altitude firebombing marked a turning point, not only in the B-29 campaign, but in the nature of modern warfare. It demonstrated the limits of technology and the willingness of nations to adopt increasingly destructive methods when earlier strategies failed. The Superfortress had been designed as a precision instrument. It had become a weapon of mass destruction. And still, the war continued. The next phase would bring decisions even more consequential than firebombing, decisions that would reshape the world forever. The atomic missions, Enola Gay, Boxcar, and the moment the world changed. By the summer of 1945, the B-29 Superfortress had already inflicted unprecedented destruction on Japan through conventional bombing. Entire cities lay in ruins, industrial output had collapsed, and transportation networks were crippled. Yet Japan had not surrendered. American leaders now faced a decision shaped by years of brutal fighting and the fear of what came next. An invasion of the Japanese home islands was expected to cost hundreds of thousands of Allied lives and millions of Japanese casualties. In this context, the most secret project of the war moved from theory to reality. The Manhattan Project had produced a new weapon, unlike anything humanity had ever seen. The atomic bomb promised destruction on a scale far beyond conventional explosives. The aircraft chosen to deliver it was the B-29, modified specifically for the mission. These aircraft were lighter, faster, and stripped of unnecessary equipment. Their crews were specially selected and trained in secrecy, often without knowing the true nature of their cargo until the final briefings. On August 6, 1945, a B-29 named Enola Gay, piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets, took off from Tinian. Its target was the city of Hiroshima. At 8:15 a.m., the bomb was released. Seconds later, a blinding flash lit the sky. The explosion destroyed much of the city instantly. Tens of thousands of people were killed in moments. Fires spread rapidly. Survivors were left with injuries and radiation sickness no one yet fully understood. The scale of destruction was beyond anything witnessed before. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second B-29, Boxcar, piloted by Major Charles Sweeney, carried out another atomic mission. Mechanical issues and weather forced a last-minute change of target. The bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. Again, devastation followed. Although the terrain limited the blast somewhat, the destruction and loss of life were enormous. The world had entered the nuclear age. For the crews involved, the missions were surreal. They flew high above the target, felt the shock waves, and saw the mushroom clouds rise. Only afterward did the full implications begin to sink in. These were not typical bombing missions. They represented a decisive break in the history of warfare. At the same time, geopolitical pressure intensified. On August 8th, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Japanese-held territory in Manchuria. This eliminated Japan's last hope of negotiating a mediated peace. Facing atomic destruction, invasion, and collapse on multiple fronts, Japanese leadership was forced to confront reality. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed the Japanese people by radio, announcing surrender. For many civilians, it was the first time they had ever heard his voice. The war was over. Formal surrender documents were signed on September 2nd aboard the USS Missouri, officially ending World War II. The atomic missions carried profound consequences. From a military standpoint, they achieved the objective of ending the war quickly. From a moral and human perspective, they raised questions that would never fully fade. The B-29, already a symbol of overwhelming air power, became the aircraft that delivered humanity into a new and dangerous era. The Superfortress had been designed to carry conventional bombs across oceans. It ended the war carrying a weapon that changed global politics forever. The implications extended far beyond Japan. Nations around the world now understood that future wars could threaten the survival of entire civilizations. For the B-29 crews who had flown hundreds of missions before August 1945, the atomic missions were not just another operation. They marked the end of a conflict and the beginning of something unknown. Victory came, but it was inseparable from responsibility and fear of what this new power could mean. The war had ended, but the legacy of the B-29 was only beginning. Japan's surrender, occupation, and the aftermath of the B-29 campaign. Japan's surrender in August 1945 ended the fighting, but it did not end the consequences of the B-29 campaign. The Superfortress had brought the war directly to the Japanese home islands, leaving behind cities in ruins, millions homeless, and an economy on the brink of collapse. As combat operations ceased, the focus shifted from destruction to control, reconstruction, and accountability. American forces, many of them supported and supplied by the same air power that had devastated Japan, now assumed responsibility for occupying and stabilizing the defeated nation. B-29s did not immediately disappear from the skies after the surrender. In the weeks following Japan's announcement, Superfortresses flew reconnaissance and demonstration missions over Japanese territory. These flights served as a visible reminder of Allied dominance and ensured compliance during the transition period. The aircraft that had delivered bombs now delivered presence. Their engines, once symbols of fear, became symbols of authority and finality. Occupation duties were led by General Douglas MacArthur, acting as Supreme Commander for the Allied powers. American forces entered Japan without resistance. Many soldiers and airmen were surprised by the order and discipline they encountered. Japanese military units surrendered their weapons systematically. Airfields once targeted by B-29 raids were now used by Allied aircraft. The transition from enemy territory to occupied nation was swift and controlled. The physical impact of the B-29 campaign was immediately visible. Industrial centers had been destroyed repeatedly. Transportation networks were shattered. Housing shortages were severe due to the firebombing of urban areas. Food shortages threatened millions. American occupation authorities faced the enormous task of preventing famine and restoring basic services while dismantling Japan's war-making capacity. At the same time, the human cost of the bombing campaign became clearer. Survivors of incendiary and atomic attacks suffered long-term injuries, trauma, and radiation effects. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Entire families had been erased. The scale of civilian suffering forced American leaders to confront the reality that modern air warfare had consequences far beyond military targets. These realities would later influence international discussions on the laws of war and civilian protection. For the men who flew the B-29, the aftermath brought mixed emotions. Relief at surviving the war existed alongside uncertainty and guilt. Some aircrew questioned the morality of what they had done. Others focused on the belief that the campaign had saved lives by ending the war quickly. Many avoided discussing their experiences altogether, returning home and attempting to resume civilian lives that now felt distant and unfamiliar. The B-29 units themselves were gradually withdrawn or reassigned. Some aircraft were used for transport, weather reconnaissance, or post-war testing. Others were placed in storage or scrapped. The bomber that had consumed vast resources during the war was suddenly surplus. Its role as a weapon of active combat was largely complete. Yet the strategic lessons of the B-29 campaign were unmistakable. Air power had proven capable of reaching any nation, regardless of geography. Industrial capacity and civilian infrastructure were now inseparable from military power. The idea of total war, already present in Europe, had reached its ultimate expression in the Pacific. Japan's surrender marked the end of World War II, but it also marked the beginning of a new global reality. The B-29 had not only ended a war, it had introduced the possibility that future wars could threaten the existence of entire societies. The occupation of Japan would be shaped by this understanding, emphasizing reform, demilitarization, and the prevention of future conflict. As Japan began rebuilding under Allied supervision, the Superfortress faded from daily headlines. But its shadow remained. The aircraft had altered the balance of power permanently. Nations now understood that distance no longer guaranteed safety. The skies had become a direct path to national survival or destruction. Two chapters remained in the story of the B-29: the fate of the aircraft itself and the legacy it left behind. From World War to Cold War, the Superfortress in a changed world. With World War II over, the B-29 Superfortress did not fade quietly into history. Instead, it became one of the most important military aircraft of the early Cold War, bridging the gap between the propeller-driven bombers of the 1940s and the jet-powered strategic forces that would follow. The end of combat in 1945 marked not an ending for the B-29, but a transformation of its role in a world now defined by nuclear tension. In the immediate post-war years, the United States possessed a monopoly on nuclear weapons, and the B-29 was the only aircraft capable of delivering them. This fact gave the Superfortress immense strategic importance. B-29 units formed the backbone of America's early nuclear deterrent. Bases were established across the Pacific, Europe, and the continental United States, allowing the bomber to reach potential targets across the globe. The aircraft that had once been designed to end a war now existed to prevent another one. Technological improvements followed quickly. Engineers refined engines, improved reliability, and upgraded avionics. These changes led to the development of the B-50, an improved version of the Superfortress with stronger airframes and more powerful engines. Though similar in appearance, the B-50 reflected lessons learned during wartime operations and extended the bomber's usefulness into the late 1940s. The B-29 also played a major role in the Korean War. When fighting erupted on the Korean peninsula in 1950, the Superfortress was once again called into combat. It conducted strategic bombing missions against North Korean infrastructure, transportation networks, and industrial targets. Early in the conflict, the B-29 operated with relative freedom, just as it had late in World War II. However, the introduction of Soviet-built MiG-15 jet fighters dramatically altered the balance. The appearance of jet-powered interceptors marked the beginning of the end for the B-29 as a frontline bomber. MiG-15s could climb faster, fly higher, and attack with greater speed than propeller-driven fighters. Although B-29 crews adapted tactics and received fighter escort, losses increased. The Superfortress was forced to shift to nighttime operations, echoing earlier adjustments made during World War II. The Korean War demonstrated that a new era of air combat had arrived. Despite these challenges, the B-29 continued to serve in vital roles. Some aircraft were converted for reconnaissance, weather monitoring, aerial refueling, and test programs. Others were used to train crews for newer bombers. The Superfortress became a flying laboratory, contributing to the development of jet engines, radar systems, and missile technology. Even as it aged, it remained valuable. Internationally, the B-29 left a lasting imprint. The Soviet Union reverse-engineered captured B-29s to create the Tupolev Tu-4, accelerating the development of its own strategic bomber force. This act symbolized how influential the Superfortress had become. It was no longer just an American aircraft. It had reshaped global military aviation. For the men who flew and maintained the B-29 after the war, service took on a different meaning. Instead of constant combat, their mission was deterrence and readiness. Crews trained for missions they hoped would never be flown. The bomber's presence itself became a message. In the emerging Cold War, the Superfortress stood as a reminder that total war was now possible on a global scale. As jet bombers, such as the B-47 and later the B-52 entered service, the B-29 gradually became obsolete as a primary strategic weapon. Its speed and altitude were no longer sufficient against modern air defenses. By the mid-1950s, World War II reshaped the world we live in today. Its victories, losses, and lessons remind us of the cost of global conflict and the value of cooperation. By remembering this history, we honor those who lived through it and better understand the world they left behind. Thank you for watching, and thank you for remembering.